Hello and welcome back to Reading Reveries, where, as usual, you and I together are going to lose ourselves in a little bit of reading for the next few minutes. I am sitting at the dining with a cup of tea, and it's a slight smear outside the window. Today, up for reading is an essay by a quintessentially English writer, essayist rather, Charles Lamb. Famous for introducing the personal and conversational tone in the otherwise formal genre of the English essay, Lamb is always a delight to read. His essays are warm and charming that never fail to please. He's famous for his collection, Essays of Elia, where Lamb himself is Elia and his sister Mary is Cousin Bridget. Lamb first used the pseudonym Elia when writing South Sea House. He borrowed the name from an Italian clerk who worked at the South Sea House at the same time as himself. In this series of essays, Elia is an employee of a large trading house who discourses with whimsy and irony on the various objects and experiences that provoke his interest. Among the 52 essays in the collection, I thought I would read Old China today. The essay opens with Elia's declaration of love for Old China, leading to fascinating descriptions of exquisite artwork on blue pottery. This in turn throws Elia's cousin Bridget into a fit of reminiscing and rambling, all the while trying to assert the paradoxical conviction that their past enjoyments were keener than at present because such enjoyments were harder to obtain when they were young. Elia's discussion of Old China reminds Bridget that the newly purchased, extraordinarily old blue china, though beautiful, does not bring the pleasure it would have when the two were younger and anticipation greater. A purchase is but a purchase now that you have money enough and to spare. Formerly, it used to be a triumph, Bridget says. So, let's hear them talk it out in the essay then. Here's for you, Old China from Essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. I have an almost feminine partiality for old china. When I go to see any great house, I inquire for the china closet, and next for the picture gallery. I cannot defend the order of preference but by saying that we have all some taste or other of too ancient a date to admit of our remembering distinctly that it was an acquired one. I can call to mind the first play and the first exhibition that I was taken to, but I am not conscious of a time when china jars and saucers were introduced into my imagination. I had no repugnance then, why should I now have? To those little lawless azure-tinctured grotesques that under the notion of men and women float about uncircumscribed by any element in that world before perspective, a china teacup. I like to see my old friends, whom distance cannot diminish, figuring up in the air, yet on terra firma still. For so we must in courtesy interpret that speck of deeper blue which the decorous artist, to prevent absurdity, had made to spring up beneath their sandals. I love the men with women's faces and the women, if possible, with still more womanish expressions. Here is a young and courtly mandarin handing tea to a lady from a salver 2 miles off. See how distance seems to set off respect? And here the same lady, or another, for likeness is identity on teacups, is stepping into a little fairy boat moored on the hither side of this calm garden river with a dainty mincing foot which in a right angle of incidence must infallibly land her in the midst of a flowery mead, a furlong off on the other side of the same strange stream. Farther on, if far or near can be predicated of their world, see horses, trees, pagodas dancing the haze. Here, a cow and rabbit couchant and coextensive, so objects show, seen through the lucid atmosphere of fine Cathay. I was pointing out to my cousin last evening over our hyson, which we are old-fashioned enough to drink unmixed still of an afternoon, some of these speciosa miracula upon a set of extraordinarily old blue china, a recent purchase, which we were now for the first time using, and could not help remarking how favourable circumstances had been to us of late years, that we could afford to please the eye sometimes with trifles of this sort. When a passing sentiment seemed to overshade the brows of my companion. I am quick at detecting these summer clouds in Bridget. I wish good old times would come again, she said, when we were not quite so rich. I do not mean that I want to be poor, but there was a middle state. So she was pleased to ramble on, in which I am sure we were a great deal happier. A purchase is but a purchase, now that you have money enough and to spare. Formerly, it used to be a triumph, when we coveted a cheap luxury, and oh, how much ado I had to get you to consent in those times. We were used to have a debate 2 or 3 days before, and to weigh the for and against, and think what we might spare it out of, and what saving we could hit upon that should be an equivalent. A thing was worth buying then, when we felt the money that we paid for it. Do you remember the brown suit which you made to hang upon you till all your friends cried shame upon you, it grew so threadbare? And all because of that folio Beaumont and Fletcher which you dragged home late at night from Barker's in Covent Garden? Do you remember how we eyed it for weeks before we could make up our minds to the purchase, and had not come to determination till it was near 10 o'clock of the Saturday night, when you set off from Islington, fearing you should be too late, and when the old bookseller, with some grumbling, opened his shop, and by the twinkling taper, for he was setting bedwards, lighted out the relic from his dusty treasures, and when you lugged it home, wishing it were twice as cumbersome, and when you presented it to me, and when you were exploring the perfectness of it, collating you called it, and while I was repairing some of the loose leaves with paste, which your impatience would not suffer to be left till daybreak, was there no pleasure in being a poor man? Or can those neat black clothes which you wear now, and are so careful to keep brushed since we have become rich and finical, give you half the honest vanity with which you flaunted it about in that overworn suit, your old corbeau, for 4 or 5 weeks longer than you should have done, to pacify your conscience for the mighty sum of 15 or 16 shillings was it, a great affair we thought it then, which you had lavished on the old folio. Now you can afford to buy any book that pleases you, but I do not see that you ever bring me home any nice old purchases now. When you came home with 20 apologies for laying out less number of shillings upon that print after Leonardo, which we christened the Lady Blanche, when you looked at the purchase and thought of the money, and thought of the money, and looked again at the picture, was there no pleasure in being a poor man? Now you have nothing to do but to walk into Colnagi's and buy a wilderness of Leonardos. Yet do you? Then, do you remember our pleasant walks to Enfield and Potter's Bar and Waltham when we had a holiday? Holidays and all other fun are gone now we are rich. And the little hand basket in which I used to deposit our day's fare of savoury cold lamb and salad, and how you would pry about at noontide for some decent house where we might go in and produce our store, only paying for the ale that you must call for, and speculate upon the looks of the landlady and whether she was likely to allow us a tablecloth, and wish for such another honest hostess as Isaac Walton has described many a one on the pleasant banks of the Lea when he went a-fishing. And sometimes they would prove obliging enough, and sometimes they would look grudgingly upon us. But we had cheerful looks still for one another, and would eat our plain food savourily, scarcely grudging Piscator his trout haul. Now when we go out a day's pleasuring, which is seldom moreover, we ride part of the day, and go into a fine inn and order the best of dinners, never debating the expense, which after all never has half the relish of those chance country snaps when we were at the mercy of uncertain usage and a precarious welcome. You are too proud to see a play anywhere now but in the pit. Do you remember where it was we used to sit when we saw the Battle of Hexham and the surrender of Calais and Bannister and Mrs. Bland in The Children in the Wood? When we squeezed out our shillings apiece to sit 3 or 4 times in a season in the 1-shilling gallery, where you felt all the time that you ought not to have brought me, and most strongly I felt obligation to you for having brought me, and the pleasure was the better for a little shame. And when the curtain drew up, what cared we for our place in the house, or what mattered it where we were sitting, when our thoughts were with Rosalind and Arden, or with Viola at the court of Illyria? You used to say that the gallery was the best place of all for enjoying the play socially, that the relish of such exhibitions must be in proportion to the infrequency of going, that the company we met there, not being in general readers of plays, were obliged to attend the more, and did attend to what was going on the stage, because a word lost would have been a chasm which it was impossible for them to fill up. With such reflections we composed our pride then. And I appeal to you whether, as a woman, I met generally with less attention and accommodation that I have done since in more expensive situations in the house. The getting in indeed and the crowding up those inconvenient staircases was bad enough. But there was still a law of civility to woman recognized to quite as great an extent as we ever found in the other passages, and how a little difficulty overcome heightened the snug seat and the play afterwards. Now we can only pay our money and walk in. You cannot see, you say, in the galleries now. I am sure we saw and heard too well enough then, but sight and all, I think, is gone with our poverty. There was pleasure in eating strawberries before they became quite common, in the first dish of peas while they were yet dear, to have them for a nice supper, a treat. What treat can we have now, if we were to treat ourselves now, that is, to have dainties a little above our means? It would be selfish and wicked. It is very little more that we allow ourselves beyond what the actual poor can get at. That makes what I call a treat. When 2 people living together, as we have done, now and then indulge ourselves in a cheap luxury which both like, while each apologizes and is willing to take both halves of the blame to his single share. I see no harm in people making much of themselves in that sense of the word. It may give them a hint how to make such of others. But now, what I mean by the word, we never do make much of ourselves. None but the poor can do it. I do not mean the veriest poor of all, but persons as we were, just above poverty. I know you were going to say that it is mighty pleasant at the end of the year to make all meet, and much ado we used to have every 31st night of December to account for our exceedings. Many a long face did you make over your puzzled accounts, and in contriving to make it out how we had spent so much, or that we had not spent so much, or that it was impossible we should spend so much next year, and still we found our slender capital decreasing. But then, betwixt ways and projects and compromises of one sort or another, and talk of curtailing this charge and doing without that for the future, and the hope that youth brings and laughing spirits, in which you were never poor till now, we pocketed up our loss, and in conclusion, with lusty brimmers, as you used to quote it out of hearty, cheerful Mr. Cotton, as you called him, we used to welcome in the coming guest. Now we have no reckoning at all at the end of the old year, no flattering promises about the new year doing better for us. Bridget is so sparing of her speech on most occasions that when she gets into a rhetorical vein, I am careful how I interrupt it. I could not help, however, smiling at the phantom of wealth which her dear imagination had conjured up out of a clear income of a poor £100 a year. It is true we were happier when we were poorer, but we were also younger, my cousin. I am afraid we must put up with the excess, for if we were to shake the superflux into the sea, we should not much mend ourselves. That we had much to struggle with as we grew up together, we have reason to be most thankful. It strengthened and knit our compact closer. We could never have been what we have been to each other if we had always had the sufficiency which you now complain of. The resisting power, those natural dilations of the youthful spirit which circumstances cannot straighten, with us are long since passed away. Competence to age is supplementary youth. A sorry supplement indeed, but I fear the best that is to be had. We must ride where we formerly walked, live better and lie softer, and shall be wise to do so than we had means to do in those good old days you speak of. Yet could those days return, could you and I once more walk 30 miles a day, could Bannister and Mrs. Bland again be young, and you and I be young to see them, could the good old 1 shilling gallery days return? They are dreams, my cousin, now. But could you and I at this moment, instead of this quiet argument by our well-carpeted fireside, sitting on this luxurious sofa, be once more struggling up those inconvenient staircases, pushed about and squeezed and elbowed by the poorest rabble or poor gallery scramblers? Could I once more hear those anxious shrieks of yours and the delicious "thank God we are safe," which always followed when the topmost stair conquered, let in the first light of the whole cheerful theatre down beneath us? I know not the fathom line that ever touched a descent so deep as I would be willing to bury more wealth in than Cresius had, or the great Jew R is supposed to have, to purchase it. And now do just look at that merry little Chinese waiter holding an umbrella, big enough for a bed tester, over the head of that pretty, insipid, half-maidenish chit of a lady in that very blue summer house. So that was Charles Lamb's Old China for you. If for a moment you think that this is just a simple little charming read, think again, because I am about to spoil it for you. Karen Fang points out how Elia presents porcelain as a visually beguiling item that introduces in him an almost feminine desire, and that such gendered description of longing suggests Elia's near participation in a distinctly female consumer culture, and hence his representativeness for the set of social and economic attributes historically associated with this very female consumer culture. Porcelain is the key industrial commodity upon which Lamb's analogy in the essay hinges. And Lamb, privileging porcelain over traditional aesthetic experiences such as paintings and plays, as a stimulus to imagination, conflates commodity culture with aesthetic inspiration, suggesting an inclusive consumer version of the Romantic prose tradition. Did you know Lamb had a 30-year career at the East India Company, that gigantic imperial corporate global exploitative machinery? Lamb drew a generous income there, an accomplishment that his authorial work had yet to offer in his lifetime. And it can't be denied that there is a strange conflation of his service as an imperial employee and his promotion in the essay of porcelain, a leading commodity of the East India Company. So not so very simple after all, eh? Is it ever though? Did I make you think then? Did I spoil your charm a little bit? Let me know your thoughts on this thread. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining in. Be sure to tune in for another episode of Reading Reveries soon. Until then, keep well and have a good day.